What's good, MOC? Welcome back to Wednesdays in the Word. I'm your co-host, Tamise, and we've been doing the series called Mysterious Ways, How God Leads Us Through the Wilderness. And this week, we're going to talk about Moses. I think I want to start this week by reading one major passage, and you will get this passage on the screen. And it's coming from Acts chapter 7, verse 17 to 35. And in this chapter, Stephen, the first Christian martyr, is recounting for the people he's preaching to the story of Moses and of Israel. And that's where we pick it up. And it says, as the time drew near when God will fulfill his promise to Abraham, the number of our people in Egypt greatly increased. But then a new king came to the throne of Egypt who knew nothing about Joseph. This king exploited our people and oppressed them, forcing parents to abandon their newborn babies so they would die. At that time, Moses was born, a beautiful child in God's eyes. His parents cared for him at home for 3 months. When they had to abandon him, Pharaoh's daughter adopted him and raised him as her own son. Moses was taught all the wisdom of the Egyptians, and he was powerful in both speech and action. And we've seen that before in Daniel. One day, when Moses was 40 years old, he decided to visit his relatives, the people of Israel. He saw an Egyptian mistreating an Israelite, and so Moses came to the man's defense and avenged him, killing the Egyptian. Moses assumed his fellow Israelites would realize that God had sent him to rescue them, but they didn't. So the next day, he visited them again, and he saw 2 men of Israel fighting, and he tried to be a peacemaker. Men, he said, you are brothers. Why are you fighting each other? But the man in the wrong pushed Moses aside and said, who made you a ruler and a judge over us? Are you going to kill me as you killed the Egyptian yesterday? And when Moses heard that, he fled the country and lived as a foreigner in the land of Midian. There his 2 sons were born. I hope that you guys are enjoying this series. I know that I myself am getting a ton out of this. And this is my favorite biblical character. And so when I was thinking about the wilderness, obviously not just because he wrote the Deuteronomy passage, but because he's somebody that I paid a lot of attention to in my own journey. And what I like about Moses is that there's some very clear seasons in his life that I think that God tries to pinpoint for him so that he's able to lead other people through the very same wilderness. So let's talk about Moses. We know that Moses was in Egypt. He kills an Egyptian, and then he realizes that his people don't trust him and they reject him. So he runs away, and then he encounters God in the wilderness, and he's called back to lead. And he goes to Pharaoh and all of those things that we summarized earlier, so I won't get into all of that. But he's called to lead at the end of this really interesting wilderness season of his own. And we see his life split into 3 40-year snapshots. The first 40 years, he's in Egypt. The second 40 years, he's in Midian. And the third 40 years, he's actually leading the people. So we're going to look at those seasons, and we're going to look at God's leadership of Moses during those times. And I think there are 3 things that we really should take with us as we think about the wilderness, as we think about the year ahead of us, as we think about our own calling. Because that's where I want to talk today. I want to talk about the calling of Moses. Moses knew who he was. There was a very clear sense, I'm sure, that he felt. And some of us have felt that, whether it be through things that our parents have said or things that we feel inside, these inklings, that we have a purpose, that we're called to something. And so what ends up happening is Moses, while he's in Egypt, he sees injustice. He sees something that he does not agree with. And so he jumps in and he kills an Egyptian, and he buries the Egyptian in the sand, like something off of a Netflix crime documentary. And so he gets away with it. That's the thing that people don't realize, is that he had actually gotten away with it. So he comes the next day and he sees his own people fighting, right? Black on black crime, essentially. And he comes and he says, why are you guys fighting? You all are brothers. And Moses would have a he would be very attached to this idea because he grew up a Hebrew, but outside of that context, he grew up in the palace. And so for Moses, it's hard to understand, why are my own people fighting with each other? And so what he finds out is that even his own people reject him. And the guy who starts the fight turns to Moses and says, who were you trying to kill me like you killed the Egyptian? And so Moses experiences this deep sense of rejection. Not only the rejection of like not being able to live with his family, but now there's the rejection of his own people that he's finally come to be in the midst of. And so he runs away and he flees to Midian. And so people have told him that he's special. I mean, it says that he's a beautiful child. And he had a very sheltered life in the palace. But when he's finally able to go back to correct wrongdoing, to prove himself, he's rejected. And you've got to imagine what it's like for Moses, because he definitely has some things to prove. Because you know how it is. He lived in the palace. Nobody really probably thought he was real down. And so he has to kind of prove those things, but all of those things are coming out of an insecurity that I think God needed to correct in Midian. And so he's rejected. His people don't trust him. They don't really know him. I mean, who are you? You coming out the palace telling me not to hit. You don't know what's going on. You haven't even been here. And so some of us have experienced that. People have not taken us seriously, or they don't trust us because they think we're new to the situation or that we don't have anything to offer. So I want us to really feel that as we think about what goes on when Moses is in Midian. So he runs away and he rescues these young women. See, there's that sense of calling. The gifts and the callings of God, they're irrevocable. And it says that he's sitting by a well, and he rescues these young girls who are being harassed by some other shepherds. And so because of that, the father of the young girls takes Moses in and gives him a job as a shepherd. Now, what you've got to understand about this is that this is a significant, humbling experience. He went from being a regent in the palace of Egypt to working with stinky, funky sheep in the mountains, right? But you know what? That's where God meets him. And I think that's so important for us to think about, is that God may have called us, but he doesn't necessarily commission us until we hit this place of humility, until we hit this place of significant humbling and needing to be reminded of who it is that we are from the mouth of God himself. And we see that that's what happens to Moses. Moses is tending the sheep. He has embraced this job, and he sees a bush, and the bush is burning, but it's not on fire. And he looks, and he's like, something is not right here. The bush is burning, but it's not being corrupted by this fire. The fire is not engulfing the bush. And so he turns aside to see. He takes time to pay attention to what God might want to do. And so when he encounters God, God tells him, you've been right this whole time. I do hear the cry of my people. And he says to him, let's look at it in the passage. This is in Exodus in chapter 2, verse 24. And it says, God heard their groaning, and he remembered his covenant promise to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And he looked down on the people of Israel and knew it was time to act. So sometimes our calling is not fully realized because it's not the right time. Timing is a huge factor in our calling in God. And so later on, when he's encountering Moses, God says to Moses, now go. This is chapter 3, verse 10. It says, now go, for I am sending you to Pharaoh. And so there was no question about Moses' calling. The issue was timing. And some of us need to hear that today. Don't let the timing of God, don't let the enemy use the timing of God to lie to you about your calling. The calling of God is irrevocable. There's nothing that you can do to remove the calling of God. This guy murdered somebody, okay, and buried them in the sand, and apparently never got caught, okay? So if that's true for Moses, that's true for us. The issue is not whether God is confused about your calling, the issue is his timing. But there's another thing that has to get worked out with Moses that I think is really, really, really interesting. Later on in Moses' encounter, before he's sent back to the people, it says that God says to Moses, "This is my eternal name, my name to remember for all generations." In verse 16, "Now go and call together all the elders of Israel." And then in verse 18, it says, "Then you and the elders must go to the king of Egypt and tell him." Now, you guys, most of us never hear about these elders that went with Moses. So there's the issue of right timing, but then there's also the issue of the right team. Moses didn't have the right people around him. Now, God says, here's what I want you to do. Here's what I'm calling you to do, but I want you to go and get some elders. And some of us need to hear that and take that to heart, especially nowadays. There are people, undoubtedly people in our churches, in our lives, people who have gone before us that have so much wisdom to impart to us in crazy times because they've lived through crazy times. Not only that, but our calling might be the answer to some of their prayers. When Moses goes to these elders, can you imagine what it would have been like to have heard the promise of Abraham and been waiting for it? You're a slave in Egypt, but God told Abraham that we would be numerous and that we would be a blessing to the nations. Moses had to go to the elders because God had to tell the elders why they were in the wilderness. And so his calling had to be connected with the right team. And then there's people just in our lives that gotta go. I mean, there are things that we cannot walk out without the right team around us. And God will show us those people. So not only is he covered by elders, he also has peers. And we see that he and God get in this argument. And finally, God ends up saying, okay, fine, I'll send Aaron with you. And so God is building Moses up, but he's also building Moses' team. And so even if it's not the right timing, it might be that we don't have the right team. But let's look at the third thing before we close. In verse 10 of chapter 4, it says, Moses pleaded with the Lord, "Lord, I'm not very good with words. I've never been, I'm not now. And even though you've spoken to me, I get tongue-tied and my words get tangled." And the Lord says to Moses, "Who makes a person's mouth? Who decides whether people speak or do not speak, hear or do not hear, see or do not see? Is it not I, the Lord? Now go. I will be with you as you speak, and I will instruct you in what to say." Now, before we get angry at Moses, I think it's really easy to read this passage and not understand the level of rejection this young man has experienced in his life. He had to leave his family in the midst of a genocide. He's floating up a river, gets picked up by these rich people, doesn't know really where he came from, has kind of contact with his family for 3 months out of his life, and then he lives a completely different life. Then finally, he goes, after 40 years, he goes, and he's like, "My people, what's up?" And his people are like, "Who are you? Like, what do you have to offer us?" And so rejection on all of these levels undoubtedly leads to him doubting himself. And I suspect that even some of the ways that he tried to walk out of his calling was about proving himself for the wrong reasons. So it wasn't until God tells Moses who you are. It wasn't until God proclaimed over Moses who God had made him to be, and more importantly, who God himself was, that Moses was able to go now and lead these people out. Because we see right after this moment, right after God gives Moses the truth about himself, he goes to the Pharaoh. Now, the thing is that just because our timing might be right, and just because we have the right team, there's this third element that's very important for us as we think about our calling to lead, and that's right thinking. Moses was not clear about who he really was, and who he was built on a foundation that was going to fail him for the task ahead. And so God had to get these three things in place: the timing, the team, and the thinking. Moses needed to know who God said he was. Moses needed to have God remove that doubt and speak truth over the lies that his life had been proclaiming to him. And so that's my challenge to you today. Where does God need to correct your thinking about who you are? It's important that in these seasons, especially seasons like this, that we are confident in what God says about us, that we are fearfully and wonderfully made, that we are masterpieces who have God has prepared works for us to do in advance. And so, Mount on Campus, as we close this week, think about this. You may be called, but it might not be the right time. And are you okay with that? You might know it's the time, but you're unwilling to let go of the wrong team. You might need to think about that. And lastly, you might know that it's the right time and you've got the right people around you, but you don't believe the truth about who God says you are, and it's time for that to change. So this week, we want to thank you for coming to Wednesdays in the Word, and next week, we're going to finish it up with the most important person in Scripture and their experience in the wilderness. Thanks so much for coming to Wednesdays in the Word. Let's talk about some of these things Friday live on Zoom at 12:30. We'll put the link in our Facebook group. Thank you all for coming. Grace and peace.